They looked me in the eye after 34 years of loyal service and said, "We don't need you anymore. The system does your job better." I watched them laugh as I walked out of that room, glasses clinking, celebrating like my silence was surrender. But they had no idea that silence was never weakness. It was the beginning of their downfall. Thank you for watching and giving me your time. It means more than you know. And before I go further, I would love to know where you are watching from. So please share it in the comments, because every story has its own place, and I always wonder where mine will be heard. I want you to feel the weight of what happened. Not just the moment they pushed me aside, but the years before it. The years when I gave everything I had. I missed birthdays, anniversaries, quiet dinners at home, even Christmas mornings, because I believed that the work I was doing mattered. I believed loyalty still had value. I wore that badge with pride. I showed up early. I stayed late. I carried their problems on my shoulders. And all the while I told myself that one day, when the time came, they would honor that devotion. Instead, they sat me down like I was nothing, spoke in rehearsed words about efficiency and progress, and then they laughed together as if cutting me out was sport. I did not raise my voice. I did not plead. I simply watched and listened. And in that silence, a different kind of strength began to grow. They thought they were dismissing an old man, but what they really did was create the very storm that would swallow them whole. I want you to understand who they were and how they treated me before that final day came. Because betrayal never arrives all at once. It creeps in little by little until suddenly you see it for what it is. When I first started with that company, I was young, strong, and proud to wear their name on my chest. I shook the hand of the founder himself, and he told me that hard work and loyalty would never go unnoticed. I believed him, and for decades, I held on to that promise, working side by side with men and women who became like a second family to me. We celebrated small victories together. We pushed through long nights when projects seemed impossible, and when something broke down or a mistake was made, they all turned to me because I knew how to fix it, and I never turned them away. But as the years passed, things began to shift. New faces filled the halls. Younger managers with polished shoes and empty smiles spoke in numbers instead of names, and I noticed they looked at me differently, not as the steady hand that held the place together, but as a relic of another time. At first, it was small comments, someone chuckling about my age when I preferred to work through paper files instead of endless screens, or calling me old school as if it were a weakness. I laughed along sometimes, pretending it didn't cut. But inside I could feel the respect thinning, the air growing colder each time. The hardest part was not the jokes, it was the silence, the way conversations stopped when I entered the room, the way decisions were made behind closed doors where I was no longer invited, and the way they treated my experience as something that slowed them down instead of something that guided them. I kept telling myself it was just the times changing, that if I stayed steady, I could ride the wave. But the wave had already been set against me. They were preparing to erase me long before the meeting where they fired me, and I see now that every whisper, every smirk, every shrug was part of the dismissal they had rehearsed in their minds. I carried on with my work as if nothing was wrong, but every night when I came home, I felt the weight pressing heavier, and I began to notice things I had ignored before. Shortcuts in contracts, numbers that didn't add up, decisions that favored greed over honesty. I didn't say a word, not then, but I started to pay attention, and while they thought I was fading into the background, I was quietly watching, quietly remembering, quietly preparing. What they mistook for weakness was the very thing that gave me the strength to endure, because in their arrogance, they never once imagined that the man they were pushing out would one day hold the keys to their downfall. When I look back on the years I gave that company, I sometimes wonder how I carried so much on my shoulders without breaking, because it was not just the long hours and the endless deadlines, it was the sacrifices I made that cut the deepest. I missed my daughter's first school play because a shipment was late, and they told me only I could fix the schedule. I missed my wife's birthday dinner more times than I can count, because I was stuck in the office balancing reports, And I even spent holidays alone at my desk while my family gathered without me, believing in my heart that it was all for a greater good, that one day the company would honor my loyalty with dignity. I kept an old badge, clipped to my belt, the same one I wore for my first day, scratched and faded from years of use. But every time I looked at it, I felt pride, because it reminded me of the journey, the blood and sweat poured into those walls. For a long time I believed that sacrifices were seeds, and that one day they would grow into something meaningful. Maybe a handshake of respect at my retirement, maybe a plaque with my name, maybe just a few words of gratitude. But instead of seeds, all I had planted was an excuse for them to use me until there was nothing left to take, and then cast me aside like worn-out machinery. You see, loyalty is a dangerous gift when given to those who do not value it, and I realized too late that while I was giving away my life in hours and years, they were counting profits and planning futures that did not include me. Still, I held on because I believed that hard work must eventually be recognized. And I told myself that even if the world changed, even if technology replaced many things, no machine could ever replace heart, wisdom, and the experience of a man who had walked the path for decades. But one afternoon, I overheard two of the new managers talking outside my office door. They laughed and said, "Once the system is fully trained, we won't need him at all. The old man is just baggage now." I froze. Every part of me wanted to step out and confront them, to shout that I had given more to that company than they ever would. But instead, I sat in silence, my hands shaking, my badge heavy on my belt, and I realized in that moment that they had already erased me in their minds. That night, I could not sleep. My head filled with the faces of my family, the birthdays and holidays I had missed, and I asked myself if it had all been worth it. I remembered the look in my wife's eyes when I promised her that all my hard work was for our future, and the way my daughter used to wait by the window for me to come home only to fall asleep before I arrived. Those memories broke me more than the words of my managers, because I knew I had given something precious away that could never be reclaimed. And yet, beneath the sorrow, a different feeling began to grow, a steady, quiet anger that sharpened with every thought. Because, while I could not change the years I had lost, I could make sure that their cruelty, their arrogance, and their betrayal would not go unanswered. So I began to pay even closer attention, storing away the truth of their corruption in my mind, collecting the evidence they never thought I would notice. And as each day passed, while they dismissed me as a relic, I was quietly shaping the very weapon that would bring them down. They believed they had taken everything from me, but what they had really done was awaken something far more dangerous than their machines could ever predict. Because my silence was not the silence of defeat, it was the silence of a man who had decided that his time had finally come. The more I watched them, the more I saw how little they thought of me. And it was not always in grand gestures or harsh words. Sometimes it was in the smallest things. But those are the things that cut the deepest. Because they tell you exactly how people see you when they think you're too old, too quiet, too worn down to matter. I remember walking into the break room one morning, the air filled with the smell of coffee and fresh pastries, and hearing laughter stop as soon as I opened the door. Their eyes shifting, their mouths curling into little smirks before they quickly changed the subject, as if I were some intruder in a place I had given my whole life to. I sat down, sipped my coffee, and listened as one of the younger men whispered just loud enough for his friends to hear. "He should have retired 10 years ago. The machine makes fewer mistakes than he does." And though I kept my face calm, inside I felt something heavy press against my chest, a mix of anger and sorrow I could not show. It was not the first time either. They used to call me old-timer in the hallways, and though it was always with a half smile, it carried no respect, only dismissal. The kind that tells you you're already being pushed aside. At meetings, they would speak over me, cut me off mid-sentence, and sometimes laugh when I offered advice. Advice that years before they would have written down word for word, but now treated like useless chatter. I stayed quiet. I did not raise my voice, but every slight carved a mark inside me, and I remembered them all. Each word, each laugh, each moment of disrespect. I carried them like stones, heavy and sharp, building a wall inside that I would later turn into something far stronger than they ever imagined. One evening, as I gathered my papers, I overheard two of the managers talking outside the glass wall of the conference room. One of them said, "Why does he even bother? He's like a ghost walking through here. The system does his job better and faster." And the other laughed, replying, "He'll be gone soon. We just need to keep him quiet until then." I stood there, holding my worn briefcase, staring at the reflection of my own tired face in the glass. And in that moment, I realized I was no longer part of their future. I was just a shadow they were waiting to erase. I walked past them without a word, but inside I felt a fire begin to rise. Not the wildfire of rage, but a steady one, the kind that burns slow and bright, feeding on every insult and every lie. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, long after the house was quiet, the lamp casting a dim glow over the stacks of papers I had brought home. And I knew then that silence was my weapon, because while they mocked me for being invisible, invisibility gave me the perfect cover to see everything they thought I would never notice. I promised myself I would not waste my pain shouting at closed doors. I would use it to open the right ones. And in that promise, I began to find strength again. A strength I thought I had lost in the weight of their betrayal. I knew from that night onward that every step I took inside that building had to be careful, steady, and deliberate, because they had already written me off. And that gave me the freedom to see what they could not see, to notice the cracks forming beneath the shiny surface they were so proud to parade in front of investors and clients. They thought the new system made them untouchable, that it could hide their mistakes and polish their lies. But I had been there too long. I knew where the numbers didn't add up. I knew which contracts were rushed through without proper approval, and I knew the corners they cut when they thought no one was looking. They believed they had silenced me. But in that silence, I was listening more closely than ever, storing away every detail, every careless word, every line on every page that could one day become their undoing. It was almost amusing to watch how blind they were, how their arrogance kept them from realizing that the man they dismissed as useless was the one who carried the deepest knowledge of their flaws. They would gather in meetings, tapping on their screens, praising the machine for its speed and efficiency, while I sat quietly, taking notes not on what they wanted me to see, but on what they wanted to hide. I saw the discrepancies between reports, the missing figures, the backroom deals they covered with vague language, and each time I found another piece, I tucked it away like a weapon waiting for its time. They thought I was fading into the background, but really, I was building the kind of memory no machine could ever hold. A memory sharpened by betrayal and fueled by the hunger for justice. The hardest part was pretending not to notice, walking through the halls each day with the weight of knowledge pressing against me, while they smirked and whispered, thinking they had reduced me to nothing. I let them think it. I let them enjoy their little victories, because I knew something they did not. I knew that their celebration was temporary, that the higher they lifted their glasses in mockery, the harder they would fall when the truth came crashing down. And as I drove home each night, staring at the badge hanging from my mirror, I whispered to myself that patience would carry me through, that revenge was not about shouting in their faces, but about watching them crumble when the world saw who they truly were. So I kept working, kept gathering, kept waiting, and though they believed my silence meant defeat, it was in fact the sound of a storm building slowly. The kind of storm you cannot see until it is already upon you, tearing through everything you thought was secure. And with each passing day, the storm inside me grew stronger, ready to show them that the man they tried to erase was the very one who would write the ending to their story. The longer I stayed quiet, the more careless they became. And it was in that carelessness that I began to see everything clearly, as if the mask they wore had slipped without them realizing it. They trusted the machine so completely that they stopped paying attention to the details. They signed papers without reading them. They cut deals with partners who cared only about fast money, and they bragged in private meetings that regulators never checked deeply enough to catch them. I sat there, invisible in the corner of those rooms, listening as they whispered about loopholes and shortcuts. And each time I heard another lie slip from their mouths, I felt my silence grow heavier, not as a burden, but as a weapon that was sharpening itself with every secret they revealed. I began to notice how their greed spread like a disease through every part of the company, how projects that were once handled with care became rushed and sloppy, how safety rules that had protected us for decades were brushed aside in favor of speed, and how they all laughed about saving money while putting others at risk. I knew then that it was no longer just about me being discarded. It was about what kind of men they truly were. Men who saw no value in loyalty, no value in honesty, and no value in human lives as long as the numbers on their reports kept rising. That realization filled me with a strange calm, because it meant that when the time came, the world would see not only what they had done to me, but what they had done to everyone who trusted them. I started making copies of documents, carefully and quietly, never drawing attention, never rushing, always moving with the patience of a man who understood that time was on his side. I backed up emails, stored contracts, highlighted numbers that didn't match, and hid them away where no one could reach them. Every piece was like another brick in the wall I was building. And I knew that when the wall was complete, it would come crashing down on top of them, with a force they could never escape. They were so busy laughing at me, so busy congratulating themselves for being clever enough to replace a man with a machine, that they never even looked over their shoulders to see that I was still there, quiet, steady, and watching. And every time they mocked me, every time they spoke of me as though I had already disappeared, I told myself to remain still, because silence was my greatest disguise. They thought I was finished, but what they didn't understand was that my story had only just begun. And soon, their own arrogance would write the ending for them. I knew I had to keep moving carefully, because men like them never imagined that someone they dismissed could hold so much power in his hands, and that arrogance made them blind to what was happening right beneath their noses. I began organizing everything I had collected, each document, each contract, each email, and I laid them out in a way that told the story of their greed without me ever having to raise my voice. I didn't rush it. I worked late into the night at my kitchen table, my old lamp burning as I traced their lies one by one. And the more I pieced it together, the clearer it became that I wasn't just building a case for myself. I was building a mirror that would show the world exactly who they were. It was a strange kind of satisfaction, sitting in that quiet room, knowing that while they celebrated my absence, while they poured drinks and toasted their shiny new system, I was shaping the truth that would bring their empire to its knees. I thought about how they looked at me on that final day, as though I were already forgotten, and I almost smiled, because they had no idea that the very man they mocked was the one holding their future in his hands. Every line on every page carried their fingerprints. Every corner they cut was another nail in the coffin they had built for themselves. And I had the patience to let it all come together at the right moment. There were nights when doubt crept in, when I wondered if I was wasting my time, if maybe I should just walk away and let them rot in their own corruption. But then I would remember the laughter, the way they clinked glasses as if throwing me away was a joke, and that memory burned hot enough to remind me that justice had to be served. I wasn't acting out of pettiness. I wasn't chasing revenge for its own sake. I was standing for something bigger, the belief that you cannot destroy a man's dignity and expect to walk away untouched. So I kept quiet, kept steady, kept building, and as the pile of evidence grew, so did my resolve. They thought my silence was nothing but the sound of defeat, but what they could not see was that my silence was the sound of preparation, the sound of a storm gathering strength, the sound of truth waiting patiently to strike. And when the time came, I knew it would not be me shouting in their faces. It would be their own actions that condemned them, and I would simply be there to let the world see it. There came a point when I realized I was holding more than just proof of their betrayal. I was holding their future, and with every passing day, the weight of it pressed harder against me, reminding me that silence is not only a shield, it can also be a sword when the time is right. I would sit in my chair late at night, the house quiet, and I would look over the folders I had built, each one thicker than the last, and I would ask myself if I was ready to let it all go, to finally release the truth into the world. Sometimes I would close my eyes and hear their laughter echo in my mind, the way they mocked me as though I had already disappeared. And that sound alone was enough to remind me that justice was not just an option. It was a duty. I thought about the men and women still working inside those walls, the ones who had no idea how much danger they were in, because greed had taken over the decisions at the top. I thought about the families who trusted that company, the clients who believed in its name, and I knew deep down that to stay silent forever would make me no different from the ones who had betrayed me. My silence had served its purpose. It had given me time, it had given me clarity, but it was never meant to last forever. There comes a moment when a man must decide whether he will walk away or stand tall, and I knew that my moment was approaching fast. The more I studied their patterns, the more I saw just how deep their corruption went, and I realized that one single move could unravel everything they had built on lies. It would not take shouting, it would not take revenge shouted from rooftops, it would take nothing more than placing the truth in the hands of those who could not ignore it. And so I made my choice, not out of rage, but out of a quiet certainty that this was the right thing to do. I would no longer be their ghost, I would be the shadow that forced them into the light, and when that light exposed them, there would be nowhere left for them to hide. I sat with that decision for days, letting it settle into my bones, and each time I thought of the moment they replaced me with a machine, each time I thought of the smirks and the whispers and the way they lifted their glasses while I walked away in silence, I felt the same calm resolve rise in me again. They believed I was gone, forgotten, erased, but they had made one mistake too many, and soon they would learn that silence is not the absence of power, it is the preparation for its most devastating use. The day finally came when they tried to parade my departure as if it were a celebration. They called it a farewell, dressed it up with polite smiles and empty words. But everyone in that room knew what it really was, a staged performance meant to hide the cruelty of what they had done. I sat there listening as one after another spoke about progress, about efficiency, about how the company was moving into a new era, and every word felt like a blade pressed against my skin. The worst of it was when the manager who fired me stood and said, "Be grateful we gave you this long," as if the 34 years I had poured into their empire were a gift from them to me, instead of the other way around. I watched their glasses rise, their laughter spill into the air, and I kept my face calm, because anger would have only given them what they wanted, the satisfaction of seeing me break. Inside, though, I felt a fire burning hotter than ever before. Not the wild fire of a man out of control, but the steady blaze of someone who knew exactly what he carried. Someone who understood that the quiet power of truth was heavier than all their empty speeches combined. They thought they were free of me. They thought that by pushing me out, they had erased not only my presence, but also the memory of everything I had done for them. But as I looked around that room, I realized something important. They were already standing on hollow ground, and I was the only one who knew how fragile it truly was. I let them laugh, I let them smile, I let them shake my hand with false warmth, because none of it mattered anymore. Their words were hollow, their pride was borrowed, and soon the weight of their own decisions would crush them. As I walked out of that room for the last time, I did not feel broken. I did not feel defeated. I felt steady, certain, ready. They had written my ending. But what they didn't realize was that I was the one holding the final page, and when it turned, it would not be the story they thought they were telling. Their downfall was already in motion, and the silence they celebrated was the very thing that would bring them to their knees. Not long after I walked away from that staged farewell, the first cracks began to show. And though they tried to cover them with polished smiles and bold announcements, I could see the unease beneath the surface. Clients started to ask questions about numbers that didn't add up. Partners began to whisper about delays and unfinished work, and the machine they trusted so blindly started producing errors that no one there knew how to correct. I watched from a distance, quiet and patient, knowing that what I held in my hands was far heavier than a few mistakes. It was the undeniable truth of their corruption, and all it would take was the right moment for that truth to come crashing down on them. There was a certain satisfaction in seeing their arrogance shaken, because these were the same men who had laughed at me, the same ones who had celebrated my absence. And now their confidence was cracking just as quickly as the foundation they had built on lies. They still had no idea that I was the one who had copied every contract, every shady deal, every corner they cut, and that I was the reason their walls were beginning to tremble. They thought the storm came from outside, from the regulators or the market, but I knew better. I knew the storm was rising from the very silence they mocked. I did not reveal everything at once. I allowed the truth to seep out slowly, enough to unsettle them, but not enough for them to know where it was coming from. It rattled them, left them scrambling for answers, whispering in corners, calling emergency meetings behind closed doors. And while they pointed fingers at one another, desperate to find someone to blame, I sat in my quiet home, steady and calm, knowing that the pieces were falling exactly where they needed to. They had taken 34 years of my life and thought they could erase me with a machine. But they had overlooked the one thing no system could ever replicate, the watchful memory of a man who refused to be broken. Their downfall had begun, and I had only shown them the beginning of what was to come. It did not take long before the storm I had prepared broke wide open, and when it did, there was no stopping it, because the truth I had gathered over those long nights carried more weight than all the lies they had stacked together. The regulators arrived one morning, unannounced and unshaken, carrying with them the very documents I had quietly placed into their hands, and in an instant, the same boardroom where they laughed at my silence became a room of panic and fear. I was not there to see their faces, but I could imagine the color draining from their cheeks, the forced smiles collapsing, the hands that once clinked glasses now trembling as they tried to explain numbers and deals they could no longer hide. They had believed themselves invincible, protected by machines and money, but nothing can protect a man when the truth he buried rises to the surface. I heard later how they scrambled, how the managers argued among themselves, blaming each other, denying what was written plainly in black and white, and I sat in my chair at home, listening to the news as calmly as if I were sipping morning coffee. My silence had been mocked, dismissed as weakness, but now it was echoing through every office, every headline, every whispered conversation that spread their shame. I did not need to raise my voice. I did not need to gloat or shout or demand recognition, because their own actions were shouting louder than I ever could. The empire they had built on arrogance and greed was crumbling under its own weight, and all I had done was give the world the push it needed to see them clearly. They had replaced me with a machine, but the machine could not save them from their own corruption. And in the end, it was not technology that destroyed them. It was the quiet strength of a man they thought was finished. And as I sat there, listening to their empire collapse piece by piece, I felt no rage, no wild joy, only a steady peace, because justice had found its way. And I had proven that silence, when carried with patience and purpose, is stronger than any weapon they could have imagined. When the dust finally settled, the company that once prided itself on progress and mocked me for being old was nothing more than a name spoken in shame. Its license stripped, its reputation shattered, and its leaders scattered like leaves in the wind. They had thought replacing me with a machine would make them stronger, but they never understood that no system could cover up greed forever, and no machine could erase the memory of a man who had given everything. I did not celebrate their fall with loud words or vengeance. I simply carried on with my life, steady and quiet, knowing that justice had spoken for me. What they destroyed was themselves, and all I had done was place the truth where it could be seen. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. Your time means more to me than I can ever say, and I hope my story reminds you that silence is never weakness when it is filled with patience and purpose. Tell me in the comments what you think. Share your own story if you feel moved to, and if you have not already, please subscribe so you can walk with me through more stories like this. Stay strong, stay wise, and stay blessed.